either heart or kidney problems and is now recuperating. The question is, does he stay on as leader of the Soviet Union? Don McNeil, CBS News, Moscow.
Correspondent Bob Schieffer is standing by tonight at the State Department, where Andropov's conspicuous absence at the Moscow parade is being noted with great interest. Bob, what do they really think at the State Department? Do they think it's a cold or something more serious?
Dan, the conclusion seems to be that Andropov is seriously ill. One official told me if this is a bad cold, it is history's first life-threatening cold. That's based on two things. Number one, Andropov's picture was seen at the parade today. His name was used by some of the speakers who spoke. That leads the analysts to believe that he is not in political disgrace, so they say the only other conclusion can be that he is seriously ill. This is simply a party that Soviet leaders do not miss.
Bob, one would like to believe that our State Department was not surprised by this.
No, I don't think so at all, Dan. Kremlinologists for some time have wondered where Andropov was. He has not been seen in public for almost 3 months now. But also they say there have been certain incoherent actions by Soviet officials. One official will say one thing, another official will take it back. They say there have been some actions on arms control that simply do not make sense, that lead one to the conclusion that whoever was supposed to be minding the store simply was not. And they say this may be the explanation.
Thank you, Bob. For President Reagan today, the decidedly upside of his policy on Grenada was up front, and as White House correspondent Leslie Stahl reports, the president was decidedly down on any questions about his policies.
More than 400 of the American medical students who were evacuated from Grenada were invited to the White House to demonstrate support for President Reagan and the military.
Welcome home.
40 soldiers who took part in the operation were also there as the president invoked the virtues of courage and patriotism. He also castigated those who criticized the invasion.
It's very easy for some snug know-it-all in a plush protected quarter to say that you were in no danger. I have wondered how many of them would have changed places with you.
The students had nothing but praise for Mr. Reagan.
I shouted for joy and thought to myself, they haven't forgotten us because we're Americans. Prior to this experience, I had held liberal political views. It is one thing to view an American military operation from afar and quite another to be rescued by one.
Defense Secretary Weinberger said the American troops may be in Grenada till Christmas, although Prime Minister Edward Seaga of Jamaica, one of the islands involved in the invasion, says the Americans could leave in a few weeks.
One doesn't know what will happen hereafter. It depends on what Cuba and what the Soviet Union does, particularly Cuba.
The president leaves on a one-week trip tomorrow for Japan and South Korea. And while Grenada is not a topic on the agenda, Mr. Reagan is expected to point to the operation there as an example of U.S. resolve to fight the spread of communism. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, the White House.
Leslie alluded to it. Defense Secretary Weinberger does say that home for Thanksgiving seems a little early for U.S. troops to clear out of Grenada. That home for Christmas might be more like it. But Sandy Gilmore reports that the U.S. troops seem to be stocking up for possibly a longer haul than that.
The American Eagle arrived in St. George's Harbor this morning loaded with U.S. military supplies, an indication that a sizable troop contingent may stay on. No longer fighting, the soldiers are now trying to win the peace, as an admiral put it.
If at all possible, that you get your insurance.
The U.S. says it wants to repair damage done by soldiers during the invasion and that it wants to help rebuild Grenada's economy.
Okay, sir, if you could just reduce that to writing for me.
Today, the Army opened a claims office for Grenadians who have suffered damage to their cars, homes, or other property.
When I came back, step was broken, the door was smashed up and everything.
Head will face the wall, hands up, spread your legs.
It is not clear how the U.S. will solve the most pressing unemployment problem, the more than 1,000 members of the People's Revolutionary Army no longer drawing paychecks. Soldiers are shipping to the United States samples of communist-made arms captured in the invasion. President Reagan will get at least one souvenir. An Army commander said he has ordered men to check out what he called rumors of a mass grave in the Calavini area, thought to contain the bodies of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop and others killed in the military coup.
I've heard estimates from 17 to 200, depends on who you talk to.
So that's how many could be buried in one place?
Possibly.
You're on to Spy Satellite Radio, 990 kilohertz.
Radio waves, once controlled by the Marxists, are now controlled by the Americans, working with pre-revolutionary Grenadian announcers. A new song by a Grenadian has become a hit.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, thanks to America.
Sandy Gilmore, CBS News, Grenada.
In Turkey, the conservative Motherland Party, led by American-educated Turgut Özal, has won the first general election since the 1980 military coup. The military-backed party finished third in Turkey's three-way race. However, it is not clear when Turkey's military president will ask Özal to form a civilian government. Even opponents of the MX missile are conceding tonight that it may have been the last round and that they lost it. They lost when the Senate today approved the spending of more than $2 billion to produce and install the first 21 of these multiple warhead nuclear missiles. What has to be the year's most photographed active volcano is putting on yet another spectacular display. For the 11th time this year, Hawaii's Kilauea Volcano is in major eruption, including pre-dawn fountaining 10 to 30 feet in the air. A lava stream more than 5 miles long is headed for the wilderness. The eruptions this year have covered some 5,700 acres. A middle-of-the-night bomb blast on the sunset side of the U.S. Capitol today left congressional cloakrooms in shambles and some priceless pieces of history in ruins. The Senate had canceled a late-night session, the main reason why there were no injuries. Just 3 weeks ago, a tourist was able to enter the House gallery with a homemade bomb. Phil Jones is on Capitol Hill.
As daylight covered the Capitol building and with security noticeably tightened, the understandably edgy police force and the shaken politicians were agonizing over what one senator described as the price for democracy.
You can bomb the Capitol, you cannot bomb the democracy, and that's what is at issue.
The damage could be viewed from the outside, the shattered windows blown out by the power of the bomb. The explosion had occurred in the corridor just off the Senate chamber. A bomb had been left in this alcove, the blast spreading in all directions. Walls and ceilings were scarred and windows were knocked out of the Republican cloakroom. Today, a clock that had stopped at the time of the bombing was running again, but without its glass face. Wood had replaced glass knocked out in Democratic leader Robert Byrd's office. And as senators viewed this, they thought about what might have happened had the Senate not canceled last night's late session.
Had we been in session at 11 o'clock, beyond the shadow of a doubt, there would have been grave injury and perhaps loss of life to members and to staff.
And Democratic leader Byrd couldn't help but wonder if this had something to do with recent life-threatening phone calls he had received.
I was talking with my staff, part of my staff, in the meeting yesterday, and I said that something is going to happen here. I just hope we're not in it.
FBI agents had little to go on except 2 phone calls prior to the explosion and a communique delivered to at least one news organization today from a group called the Armed Resistance Unit, taking credit for the bombing to protest U.S. military actions in Grenada, Lebanon, and Central America. The Capitol was on alert much of today as police checked out numerous reported bomb threats. Security changes have been approved, including reducing and in some areas eliminating public access. But a conflict still remains between the politicians who want the people to continue to have easy access and security officials who are warning that in these times of terrorism, this public building can no longer remain so public. Phil Jones, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
Whether in spite of the bomb or because of it, senators today insisted on trying to conduct legislative business as usual. And this produced some unusual legislation. For the second time in 4 months, it was up to Vice President Bush to cast the tie-breaking yes vote in favor of new nerve gas weapons. The sounds of conventional weapons filled the air again today in Lebanon, north of Beirut, under the onslaught of Syrian-backed PLO rebels. PLO chief Yasser Arafat and his forces retreated from the Bedwa refugee camp into the streets of ancient Tripoli. Larry Pentak reports that Arafat, his back to the sea, is running out of time and choices.
The battlefield is now Tripoli itself. Lebanon's second largest city is the hostage in the war between Arafat and his enemies. A handful of Arafat loyalists still cling to Badawi camp just outside the city. But the Syrians and PLO rebels have fought their way to the camp's edge. and the last loyalist defenders are fighting a holding action, trying to slow them down, give the few people left inside Badawi time to get out. The bulk of Arafat's forces have already taken up positions in the streets of Tripoli. The combined rebel and Syrian forces have sealed off all escape routes. Shelling of the city was sporadic today, but it was enough to give the Lebanese who live there a taste of what may come. This shell fell just a block from a building where Arafat was mapping strategy. Its victims were Lebanese, people with no stake in a Palestinian civil war, unable to comprehend why it has suddenly engulfed them.
People simply do not want to accept the reality of what is occurring, of a sort of fratricidal inter-Arab, inter-Palestinian combat.
Thousands have already fled. Others continue to get out while they still can. The PLO chief was summoned today to a meeting of Tripoli power brokers. Some of them want him to evacuate his men by sea to save the city. Afterward, Arafat said he will do whatever the city leaders formally ask.
I told them our decision that we're concerning the peace and war in this town. It concerns only to their will and to their decision.
Nor in a separate interview did Arafat seem interested in the idea of talks with his enemy.
Abu Musa has said that he is willing to negotiate. Are you willing to talk to him?
That did not appear to be a prospect he welcomed. Larry Pintack, CBS News, Tripoli.
In Beirut, U.S. Marines turned over one of their most vulnerable outposts to Lebanese Army soldiers. As many as 200 Marines had manned that outpost about 2 miles from their airport headquarters. The post was virtually next door to strongholds of Shiite Muslims shelling the Marine positions. In West Beirut, Muslims observed a general strike today to protest the Israeli slowdown of bridge traffic across the Awali River in southern Lebanon. Israel reopened the bridges yesterday, but is allowing only pedestrians to cross southward and has slowed car traffic northward to a trickle. It was the murder of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop by Grenadian soldiers last month that eventually brought about the U.S. attack. Bishop's body has not been found, but today U.S. officials uncovered the remains of 4 bodies in a common grave near the Point Salinas airport. Army forensic experts say they have reason to believe that one of the bodies may be Bishop's. The last of the more than 600 Cubans taken prisoner 2 weeks ago left Grenada today on their way home. Joining the 103 prisoners on the plane were 11 Cuban women and children from their embassy on Grenada. There's still some dispute as to how many Cubans died in the fighting. The general in command of the U.S. ground forces today said 71, but the State Department estimated 50. The general also said 160 Grenadian soldiers were killed. The Federal Communications Commission today voted for an important and controversial change in the 8-year-old policy on broadcasting political candidate debates. Under this new FCC decision, networks and local stations may stage their own debates among major candidates for an office without granting equal time to every other candidate as well. Now, do you feel a constant need to reach out and touch someone? Are you bothered by the thought of being away from the telephone at any time of day? Well, if that's the case, Ned Potter can teach you how to spell relief.
This is the newest kind of office in America, and this is the telephone which will ring in it.
Hi, Betty. This is Dave Milan. Is John around?
Dave Milan is among the first commercial users of a cellular mobile phone. He's an insurance agent, and being in touch is important to him.
I'm in my car possibly 2 to 3 hours a day. So I save that time. It's as if I'm in the office.
But the breakthrough of cellular phones is that Dave Milan can call from his car while thousands of others do the same. In metropolitan Chicago, an area of 7 million people, the old system allowed only 23 mobile calls at once. The radio channels are too full for more. Now, the region is divided among 17 relay stations called cells, and as Milan makes his way through the suburbs and down the interstate, a central computer automatically switches his call from one cell to the next. The computer can juggle 50,000 calls an hour.
Okay, could you have him call me? Do you know what time he'll be back?
Milan says he can almost always hear clearly. The phones are expensive, $3,000, but a dozen companies are building them, and they all say the price will drop with technological breakthroughs.
I like to say the technology will go from a phone in the car to a phone in the briefcase to finally a phone in your pocket.
And this is it. This is a portable cellular phone. You'll be able to take this to any American city and call virtually any place in the world. And its maker, Motorola, says a smaller version than this will be on the market next year.
Mobility, portability is very critical to our ability to grow and increase the business that we're about.
People will buy it in much the same way that they buy a video recorder, which at one time, not very long ago, was prohibitively expensive.
An expert says portable phones may not change us, but they'll speed up the changes that are already happening. We're already a mobile society, and this will make us more so. Ned Potter, CBS News, Chicago.
His 3 years in office ranged from the new frontier of space to the brink of nuclear conflict over Cuba. Tonight, a try at a clear-eyed look at the JFK legacy, 20 years after that national outpouring of grief and tears. It ended Monday, November 25th, with the burial of our 35th president. For 4 days, the world had stood still, united in agony, remembering that he had destroyed myths. A Roman Catholic could be president. A president could be young. He was 43 when elected. After Dallas, he became myth. And today, 20 years later, Americans still are drawn to the flame. No sooner had he taken office than the Russians put the first man in space. Historian William Leuchtenberg believes Kennedy's response to that may be what history remembers most of his presidency.
He made the commitment to put a man on the moon. And 100 years from now, that may seem a lot more important than the new frontier and the controversies at the time.
Kennedy's good friend, historian William Manchester, disagreed at the time with sending a man to the moon.
I said, you're going to just fill the sky with junk. And when the money should be going into the ghettos. And Kennedy's reply was, look, he said, I couldn't get, from this Congress, I wouldn't be able to get money to clear up the ghettos. He said, but they will give me the money for the space program, and that means a lot of jobs.
Let's talk about civil rights. You maintain that civil rights will be one of the things for which President Kennedy is remembered. What about the argument is that he almost missed that train, that he just barely managed to grab a hold of the caboose of the civil rights movement, that he wasn't ahead, that he was behind?
He was behind in the beginning.
For Kennedy, the beginning was September 1962, and the struggle to enroll James Meredith at the University of Mississippi. 8.5 hours of fighting between U.S. troops and rioters. 2 people killed, 150 arrested. But the black man, Meredith, remained. The next summer, it was Birmingham, Alabama. Civil rights activists versus segregationists. The president defined the issue and articulated the national conscience.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. Whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated.
He almost missed the bus, but having boarded the bus, he got behind the wheel and was the driver.
The taping of Martin Luther King was done during the Kennedy administration, and
Right.
indeed the order to do it was given by the president's brother, then the Attorney General.
Bobby told me that.
Wouldn't you consider this a black mark on the Kennedy legacy?
Certainly. And we must realize that people in public office are no different than we are. And then the man who has nothing in his closet may not have anything up in the attic either.
President Kennedy cast himself as a cold-eyed Cold War warrior. It was Kennedy who sent the first significant numbers of American troops into Vietnam. And it was Kennedy who in 1961 poured American prestige into the Bay of Pigs with disastrous results.
He foresees a confrontation before his term is out. There is a sense of high noon, of a shootout about that. And Reagan's actions in Grenada can be said to be a descendant from that kind of way of looking at the world.
The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 may have brought the world closer to that nuclear shootout than it's ever been. But Khrushchev finally backed down and removed the Soviet warheads from Cuba. Kennedy considered it his finest hour.
And each action that we took raised the prospect that it might escalate with the Soviet Union
into a nuclear war. So it's very difficult to always make judgments here about what the effect will be of our decisions on other countries. In this case, it seemed to me that we did pick the right one. In Cuba of 1961, we picked the wrong one.
Kennedy's last triumph was the nuclear test ban treaty banning atmospheric testing.
Now, for the first time in many years, the path of peace may be open. Let history record that we, in this land, at this time, took the first step.
Who was the real Kennedy? War maker, peacemaker, both? An incomplete president, or simply an incomplete presidency? A short 3 years was his time at the top. 3 years for historians to debate and analyze. But 3 years that seared the American soul, with questions left unanswered and promise unfulfilled. A president of the United States who might run for re-election met today in Japan with a prime minister who is running for re-election. And White House correspondent Bill Plant reports both leaders seemed more concerned with appearances than with any no-nonsense negotiation.
There was plenty of pomp and circumstance and little substance on Ronald Reagan's first visit to Japan as president, just the way both sides wished it to be. Mr. Reagan was greeted by the 82-year-old Emperor Hirohito, Japan's head of state, at Akasaka Palace, where the Reagans are staying. The main issues on the table are trade and defense. The U.S. would like Japan to ease its restrictions on imports and cut down its $20 billion trade surplus with this country. Washington would also like Tokyo to spend more on its own defense. But the substantive issues will be muted in discussions over the next 3 days because both sides are more interested in projecting a strong image of good feeling. The president's message here will be one of peace and prosperity, a theme he is also expected to use at home in the coming campaign. Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone, with whom Mr. Reagan held meetings today, is facing elections soon, probably before the end of the year, and he finds the visit of the American president politically useful.
Mr. President, did you discuss trade and security?
Oh, a lot of things, Helen. Security here is overwhelming, with just over 20,000 police a day assigned during the Reagan visit. Demonstrations, most of them anti-American, went on day and night, but they weren't large by Tokyo standards. Security almost caused a glitch in a quiet get-together in the country. Prime Minister Nakasone has invited Mr. Reagan to his retreat near Tokyo for private talks. But local people feared that the president's helicopter, scheduled to land in a nearby schoolyard, could be the target of terrorist action and that the children would then become victims. But worried parents and teachers finally accepted the government's promise of security. Mr. Reagan's schedule of ceremonial and public events will be televised heavily here in Japan, leading a foreign ministry official to voice the hope that the television would convey what he called the president's charming personality, the better to counter the idea that Mr. Reagan is trigger-happy. Bill Plant, CBS News, with the president in Tokyo.
A besieged and beleaguered Yasser Arafat vowed today to fight until victory in the streets of Tripoli. Later, a ceasefire with attacking Syrian-supported PLO rebels was announced, but not confirmed, as shells and rockets continued to hit the Lebanese city. Alan Pizzi is there.
Yasser Arafat showed no sign today that he was ready to give in to suggestions that he should leave Tripoli and thus save it from becoming the front line. He spent part of the day rallying troops in the port area. Other Arafat men have pulled their multiple rocket launchers into the central city. This is precisely what the politicians are working to avoid, because the roar of outgoing fire inevitably brings retaliation. At least one person was injured when a rocket slammed into this building close to one occasionally used by Arafat. Syrian-backed anti-Arafat gunners began to shell the harbor, perhaps trying to sink ships thought to be bringing in arms. The oil refinery was also hit again.
I think we are at the edge of a very dangerous situation.
Arafat's front line is still Badawi refugee camp just outside Tripoli, but its defenses are thin. In some areas, only a few gunmen roam the muddy streets or occupy buildings deserted by refugees who have moved into Tripoli, hoping Arafat will save them.
I'll do all my best to avoid any confrontation inside the city.
Local authorities say several hundred people have been wounded and almost as many have been killed. In spite of losses, Arafat is thought to have about 5,000 men still with him. Informed sources here said as many as 5,000 heavily armed members of Tripoli's most powerful Muslim militia unit also back him. That strength in the city is no comfort to the civilians, who must put their hope in less violent protection.
Right now, Arafat's fight for his future is as much a political struggle as it is a military one. But if mediation efforts fail, this city could become the next battleground. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Tripoli.
With Mideast tensions already high, Israel today held a scheduled mobilization drill with a call-up of reservists. The drill was announced on Israeli television with code words for military units appearing on the screen. Reservists grabbed their uniforms and gear and reported to prearranged staging areas. The space-based telescope called IRIS has two new discoveries today under its asteroid belt. What could be an asteroid or dead comet closer to the sun than any other known object, and 3 mysterious bands of solar system dust. And for something completely different, IRIS not only discovers dust, it can also see through it by computer enhancement. This is the center of our own Milky Way. Dust, and all part of what's being called our first real roadmap of the universe. Closer to the ground, the NASA Space Agency today showed off what it calls the covered wagon of the space age, the third and newest space shuttle, Discovery. It arrived at home port in Florida looking like $1 million and costing $1 billion. Normally, it's no big deal for top-secret State Department documents to be safe under lock and key. But in an incredible case today, Bob Schieffer reports it was an unlocked safe full of secret documents that wound up not only under lock and key, but behind bars in the hands of Washington area prison inmates.
Just how it could have happened, no one seems quite sure, but happen it did. The State Department confirmed today that a trove of highly classified State Department documents, including intelligence summaries prepared for Secretary of State Schultz, wound up in the hands of some inmates here, the District of Columbia Prison outside Washington. It happened apparently because State Department officials forgot to empty a safe that was sent to the prison workshop for repairs.
Is the department embarrassed by this incident?
I wouldn't steer you away from that conclusion.
The safe was hauled off in August, but the documents were not discovered missing until October 25th, when prison officials called the State Department and reported what had been found when the safe was opened. There was no public disclosure of that until last night, when a reporter for a Washington television station said that an inmate at the prison had given him 31 additional secret documents.
They were classified documents, some extremely high as any that I have seen, as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
A full-scale investigation is underway at the State Department as to how it all happened. Late today, a search of Lorton Prison turned up still another classified document, and the search there goes on tonight. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, the State Department.
Among the hodgepodge of Election 83 results being pondered today, in the only Senate race where the Democrat said a win for his opponent would be a win for the Reagan foreign policy, the Democrat lost. Other than that, as Bruce Morton reports, the main lesson seems to be that American voters will not reject seekers of high office anymore just for being black or just for being women.
Tonight is the beginning of a new day for Kentucky.
Martha Lane Collins became Kentucky's first woman governor. She will be the only Democratic woman holding a top statewide job and seems bound to become a national figure in the party. Her campaign was dull. Bill Allane's race for the Mississippi governorship wasn't, not after Republicans produced 3 male transvestite prostitutes who said they'd had sex with Allane. He denied it and, in an outstandingly dirty campaign, went on to beat Republican Leon Bramlett comfortably. Lamar Alexander of Tennessee is now the only Republican governor in the South. In Washington state, Republican appointee Dan Evans beat Democratic Congressman Mike Lowry for the Senate seat formerly held by Democrat Henry Jackson. Some called the election a referendum on President Reagan, and polls showed Evans pulling away as the president's popularity rose after Grenada.
I can say the state of Washington is not everything. Grenada came, the circumstances were just right. But on the other hand, it clearly is a harbinger of some good tidings for Republicans.
In Georgia, ultra-conservative Catherine McDonald had hoped to succeed her John Birch Society husband in Congress. He died aboard the Korean jet the Soviets shot down. But Mrs. McDonald lost to George Durden, a more traditional Democrat.
Their record in office will be scrutinized very carefully.
Blacks did well. Wilson Goode, a sharecropper's son, elected mayor of Philadelphia. Harvey Gantt, elected mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, a city that is 65% white. Richard Hatcher, re-elected mayor of Gary, Indiana. Women did well. Mayors Kathy Whitmire in Houston and Dianne Feinstein in San Francisco, re-elected. Issues? Ohio voters turned down an initiative to cut taxes. U.S. military aid to El Salvador lost in Boulder, Colorado, San Francisco, California, and Seattle, Washington. Maine voted to continue its annual moose hunt. More hunters voted than moose. And in exclusive Rancho Mirage, California, former President Gerald Ford campaigned for a luxury hotel development. Frank Sinatra campaigned against it. Ford won. The sheep who are living there now lost. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Washington.
Tonight, the hindsight of the JFK generation, now a whole generation older. Terry Drinkwater looks at the history that was, the future that was not, what died along with John Kennedy that day in Dallas, and what did not.
John Kennedy had said that morning in Texas, "We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it." Dallas, then and now.
Terrible sadness and wondering what would have happened had the president lived. Would things be different now? Would they be better?
Washington, then and now. The Smithsonian playing the tapes from 20 years ago with their awful power.
Two priests in Dallas who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds.
Dallas and America are profoundly changed 2 decades later. But here at the assassin's window above Dealey Plaza, it is as though time was frozen and virtually nothing has changed.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet.
Then there was outrage that Lee Harvey Oswald could get guns so easily through the mail. And the spreading stain of political assassination led to passage of the 1968 Gun Control Act, outlawing mail-order sales. Now, efforts are underway to restore mail-order sales with some restrictions and generally require less paperwork when buying a gun.
We don't want the federal government building a record-keeping of all of the people who own firearms or who purchase ammunition.
Then and now, so many lives changed. One widow now appearing in public seldom, living in New York, working in publishing. Another widow, only 22 then, now still living near Dallas, remarried, working part-time as a maid. The Peace Corps, then and now. 2 decades later, young people still answer President Kennedy's call for service overseas. Some of the first Peace Corps workers gathered recently to reflect and remember.
Would you do it again?
Absolutely. I think most people. Pivotal experience. It changed my life.
20 years. Back then, Dallas was vilified as a city of hicks and hate.
We went through the ridicule, Dallas kills presidents. It's a sad place for us because we lost the man too.
Now, Dallas has big oil and big-time football and serves somewhat reluctantly as backdrop for a big TV soap opera about money and sex and power. Americans come to see where JR lives and where JFK died. There are plans to open the 6th floor of the building overlooking Dealey Plaza to the public.
I think that this will have a great appeal to the citizens of Dallas as well as those who visit Dallas. And this is something we really need to do, and it's time. It's been 20 years.
A healthy thing for the city?
Yes.
Time and memory. Parkland Hospital, where Kennedy was pronounced dead, and where, on the same day at the same time, Octavia Thomas was born.
They always say that when somebody dies, it's somebody being born. So I was born the day that President Kennedy was assassinated.
20 years. Octavia Thomas works in the kitchen of a Dallas rest home, dreams of a better life for her son, and thinks fondly of the president she never knew.
I don't think I would have had those opportunities if it hadn't been for him. I haven't seen one yet that's been like him.
And not far away, they still come to where it happened, drawn by the need to understand.
I suppose I could cry.
You still feel that way standing in this place after all those years?
I'm afraid so.
It was, after all, a place where school books were stored, books that may well have contained the words of the poet. Loss and possession, death and life are one. There falls no shadow where there shines no sun. Terry Drinkwater, CBS News, Dallas.
President Reagan and his Japanese hosts got down to talking at least some substance today. The president made it clear he will not insist that Japan immediately lower its protectionist trade barriers and that he will try to prevent counter-protectionist measures from being taken in this country. Leslie Stahl reports from Tokyo.
The president took a journey into Japan's past at an exhibition of the bow and arrow samurai ritual Yabusami. President and Mrs. Reagan seemed engrossed, but the pageantry of ancient times did not obscure the targets of the 20th century, the enveloping need for heavy security, and Japan's restrictions on trade. In their private talks, Mr. Reagan and Prime Minister Nakasone spoke only in generalities. On defense, Nakasone pledged to continue building Japan's military, no specifics. And on trade, the thorniest issue, President Reagan decided to help Nakasone with his approaching election by not insisting on new commitments to reduce tariffs.
We acknowledge
the achievements made thus far and agree to continue our efforts for the solution of the remaining issues.
The president did issue a warning that without some Japanese relaxing of quotas on American goods, the protectionist tide in the U.S. soon may become uncontrollable.
I didn't come to negotiate specific trade issues, but I did indicate certain issues of immediate importance to us. Japanese quotas in agricultural products are a cause for concern. In return, the United States must combat protectionism in our country. And I have given the Prime Minister my pledge to do so.
The president was confronted with constant reminders of the trade issue. Nearly every photographer on the trip was shooting with a Japanese camera. American products face steep trade barriers here, especially for citrus fruits, tobacco, and beef. Japanese sukiyaki beef costs $11 a pound, while the same beef from the U.S. costs less than $4. Japan's farmers, a powerful political bloc, don't like the competition, and Nakasone doesn't want to incur their anger with lower barriers. But if the barriers stand, Mr. Reagan's campaign could suffer. As the president went off to a formal state banquet tonight, his advisors were saying a quiet prayer that Nakasone will reward Mr. Reagan's restraint by easing some trade quotas next year in time to help Mr. Reagan with his campaign. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, Tokyo.
President Reagan's trade talks in Japan are recognition that this country's economic destiny is linked with what happens to economies far away. Bernard Goldberg offers an example that is closer to home.
They're striking in Reynosa, Mexico, and workers in Middle America are feeling the repercussions. 8,000 Mexicans have been idled by a wildcat strike at this Zenith plant, where they make parts for TV sets sold in the United States. The strikers reportedly are demanding a 100% wage boost. Right now, with fringe benefits, they earn less than $1 an hour. So why is a strike in Mexico important to Americans? Because it could force the shutdown of this Zenith plant in Springfield, Missouri. Without the components from Mexico, they can't put the TVs together here. 1,000 workers have been laid off already, and company officials say all 2,500 workers could be off the job by next Tuesday.
We got 4 kids to feed, and both of us works here. It'd be kind of hard on us.
About 600 foreign plants, most of them owned by U.S. corporations, operate in Mexico, giving jobs to 125,000 Mexicans. It's Mexico's cheap labor, U.S. executives say, that makes those American goods competitive in the world market. But one economist today said the strike in Mexico is a sign of things to come.
As more workers become urbanized and become industrialized and become incorporated into factory life, they're going to stand up and say, what's in it for me? And so you're going to get these kind of stories are going to happen more often.
American business went to Mexico in the first place because wages were low. And if Mexican wages are forced higher and higher, some insiders believe, U.S. corporations will pick up and move again to even cheaper markets, this time in Asia and even Africa. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, New York.
The Pentagon said today that the final death toll from the bombing of U.S. Marine headquarters in Beirut will stand at 239. 218 Marines, 18 Navy seamen, 3 Army soldiers. All but 2 of the dead have been identified. The FBI said today that its experts in Beirut have found that the bomb that killed those 239 Americans last month contained 6 tons of explosives, probably dynamite. There's not much to smile about for the Beirut Marines, but today they threw a birthday party for themselves, the 208th for their U.S. Marine Corps. In the time-honored rite, the first pieces of the birthday cake went to the youngest and oldest Marines present. Vice President Bush got a private preview today of a display opening tomorrow at Andrews Air Force Base, a vast array of weapons captured by U.S. troops in Grenada. Bush saw a Soviet-made anti-aircraft gun, scores of anti-tank weapons, and Czech-made small arms. He also saw Moscow-supplied armored personnel carriers. In Grenada, Sandy Gilmore reports that the situation there has settled down but is not yet tranquil.
Hundreds of Grenadians moved into a former Cuban warehouse as soon as an Army unit moved out to go home. People took food and building materials. Other American soldiers made no attempt to stop it. This is a civil matter, an officer said.
The looting of the warehouse showed the kind of problem some Grenadians and U.S. officials fear: lawlessness in the absence of civil authority in areas where U.S. troops have pulled out.
For that reason, 3,000 U.S. soldiers have stayed on. To back them up, the U.S. Army's 1st Support Command has moved in and is setting up camp near the Point Salinas Airport. They have recently brought in sea rations by the ton, tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline, and more than 300 jeeps, pickups, transport trucks, off-road vehicles, and road graders.
Maintenance support, petroleum, oil, and lubricants, fuel, you name it. I mean, we're the beans and bullets guys for the people that are here on the ground.
All of this is guarded from newly fortified positions, and it looks like the Army plans to stay a while. An Army spokesman denies the U.S. is building a permanent base, but it could turn out to be a long-term supply base. Today, soldiers hunted for snipers who just yesterday twice fired on but did not hit U.S. troops. They were the first shooting incidents in nearly a week, but it shows at least some Cubans or leftist Grenadians still haven't given up. Sandy Gilmore, CBS News, Grenada.
7 Democratic congressmen charged today that President Reagan's sending of U.S. forces to Grenada violated the constitutional right of Congress to declare war, and they said they would seek the president's impeachment. About 1,800 U.S. Marines prepared to leave North Carolina's Camp Lejeune today, headed south to Honduras. They'll make a long-scheduled amphibious landing on the northern coast, along with more than 500 Honduran soldiers. It's all part of the ongoing Big Pine 2 joint exercises, which will involve a total of 5,000 U.S. troops. 40 years after the fact, a federal judge in San Francisco today vacated the conviction of a Japanese American who refused to report to an internment camp during World War II. But more than that, the judge said the whole basis for the policy that put Japanese Americans in the camps by the thousands resulted from unsubstantiated facts, distortions, and racism. A woman went to jail in Minnesota today carrying books by Jane Austen. That may not be standard lockup reading, but Bob McNamara reports her choice of reading material isn't the only unusual thing about this lawbreaker.
Erica Boza wasn't packing this morning for a Caribbean vacation. She was headed for 10 days in jail.
I'm really embarrassed by the fuss that you're all making, because what I'm doing is not that unusual. There are lots and lots of people doing it across the whole country.
But petite and quiet Erica Boza is no average lawbreaker. 52 years old with 2 sons, her husband is the Minneapolis police chief.
Keep them under control, indeed. They're going to have to give me a bigger chair and a lighter whip.
It was at a sit-in last month that Mrs. Boza was among almost 600 other protesters arrested at the Minneapolis headquarters of Honeywell, the demonstration against the company's manufacture of nuclear weapons parts. And since it was the second time in a year Mrs. Boza had been arrested at anti-nuclear protests, she was given 10 days in jail.
Very apprehensive about going to jail, certainly. I never expected I would ever go to jail.
A heavy load, a heavy load.
Outside the small jail where Erica Boza will serve time with prostitutes and drunk drivers, the remnants of Minnesota's anti-war movement sang protest songs. But she did not. She confessed fear before surrendering.
Well, I miss my husband very much. I'm not that used to being away from him and being locked up, and that's very frightening.
I'm not embarrassed by an act of conscience. I think that she has every right to work out her own beliefs in a legitimate fashion.
Erica Boza said she sat out the civil rights movement, sat out the protests of the Vietnam War to raise a family. But now, in trying to make up for lost time, she said she had never planned on doing time. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Minneapolis.
Up to 10% of Americans suffer migraine headaches. Today, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, doctors said a medicine intended for treating heart problems can bring dramatic relief to people with migraine. This drug, which is called verapamil hydrochloride, reportedly can cut the frequency of the headaches in half and reduce pain when the headaches do occur. President Reagan left Japan tonight for South Korea. As he was winding up his Japanese visit, his hosts were releasing some most inhospitable figures on the tilted balance of trade. Japan officially announced that its trade surplus with the U.S. was almost $2 billion last month alone, second highest Japanese trade surplus ever. The biggest selling items, most responsible, cars, computers, and video recorders. Still, Bill Plant reports Mr. Reagan and his White House aides left Japan trying to accentuate the positive and talking tough about the Soviets.
President Reagan, whose mission was to solidify U.S. ties with Japan, said his farewell to the Emperor Hirohito today, confident that he had succeeded. In a televised interview with 4 Japanese journalists, Mr. Reagan appealed for understanding of his policy on nuclear weapons, a touchy subject here.
I feel that we have to be realistic with the Soviet Union. Either they join in those arms reductions, or they then have to face the fact that we are going to turn our industrial might to building the strength that would be needed to deter them from ever starting a war.
Mr. Reagan became the first American president to address the Diet, Japan's parliament. He asked the legislators to help remove still more import restrictions, one of the most difficult trade problems between the two countries. The president drew frequent applause during the nationally televised speech. But in the small town of Hinode, about 35 miles from central Tokyo, only one man, an employee of City Hall, seemed to be watching. Just about everyone else seemed to be preparing for a visit from the American president, who had been invited to the Prime Minister's country retreat. The Reagans were welcomed by Prime Minister Nakasone to his version of the Reagan Mountaintop Ranch. He was the host at an elaborate Japanese tea ceremony for which the President and First Lady removed their shoes and put on traditional Japanese garments over their clothes. The hard questions about trade between the U.S. and Japan are still unresolved, but an agenda has been set to get to the specifics. So the President and his advisors are leaving here pleased because they believe they accomplished what they came to do, showing the world that the two nations are close friends, and most important, reaffirming their alliance against the Soviet bloc. In Korea, the final stop on this trip, there is really only one issue: support for the South Korean government against North Korea and the Soviets. Bill Plant, CBS News, with the President in Tokyo.
U.S. trade relations with South Korea have problems too, but partly because Korea is smaller and partly because it is so directly threatened militarily, U.S. officials are less concerned about the protectionist trade policies there. Eric Ingberg has been traveling in Korea.
Hawkeye and his buddies at the 407 7th MASH got orders for home as soon as the Korean War ended, and home they went. But in the real world, 39,000 American troops are still on duty in Korea, more than in Grenada, Lebanon, and Central America put together.
President Reagan will come to the demilitarized zone, the reality which shapes all U.S. policy in Korea. When you talk of world trouble spots, this is what you're talking about. Here, two armies of two sworn enemies face each other like scorpions, separated only by a narrow strip of land and a few pieces of barbed wire.
On the north, the world's 6th largest military power, led by Kim Il-sung, who first invaded the South 33 years ago and has not mellowed with age. Last month, a bomb planted by his agents killed 17 high South Korean government officials visiting Burma. In the South, which has one of the best armies anywhere, soldiers chant, "Kill, kill Kim Il-sung," as they train. The U.S. job here is to keep both sides from starting something that could quickly explode into a great power confrontation. Even factory workers in South Korea stay close to their guns. But it's their work inside the plants that has given the country one of the world's fastest growing economies, first in heavy industry like steel and shipbuilding, and lately in such high-tech items as video recorders. It's gone so well that the U.S. now complains of Korean trade barriers, and the Japanese mutter that Koreans work too hard. These Samsung electronic employees put in a 12-hour day, 6 days a week, for about $250 a month. Prosperity has helped calm opposition to military rule, which 3 years ago was so strong that students took over an entire city, Gwangju, for a week before troops crushed the rebellion.
Korean government is running military dictatorship. The regime uses the security problem to pressure those who complain.
Kim is one of 300 opposition leaders to be barred from all political activity by South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan, a former general. Chun has widespread support in the countryside, where farmers worry more about North Korean guns than democratic values. But there is opposition on the campuses.
The people of Korea don't support Jun government.
Police were busy this week arresting and tear-gassing student demonstrators who blame the U.S. for befriending a dictator. The growing middle class, children of the economic boom, also want more voice in the politics of a country where rigged elections, repression, and coups have been the norm. Chun has promised free elections in 1988, but has done nothing so far to make that happen. South Korea's leap into the future is a success story, one President Reagan will be stressing here. But American officials fear that it's only part of a story, that minus political reforms, guns pointing north aren't enough to keep this country secure. Eric Engberg, CBS News, along the DMZ in Korea.
On this Veterans Day, about 700 of the nation's newest veterans came home today, home from Grenada. Troops from the 82nd Airborne Division reunited with friends and family at Fort Bragg. A more subdued Veterans Day scene today in Colchester, Connecticut, where friends and relatives honored veterans whose touch is only felt now in memory. 4 of Colchester's own who died in Vietnam. Their names now etched on a piece of the same dark stone that was used to list all of America's Vietnam War dead at the recently dedicated memorial in Washington. At that huge, stark V-shaped wall today, 68 more names have been added. 68 more names that, as Barry Peterson reports, until now were etched only in the memories of loved ones, and now finally etched in stone.
There are so many names: Joe Parks, David Craig, Thomas J. Byer, nearly 60,000 names. But for Captain Hank Kramer, stationed in San Francisco, not enough names by one, his father.
He's been forgotten, and that's what I want to correct here.
Harry Kramer, West Point graduate, decorated Korean War veteran, assigned to Vietnam in 1957 and killed in a training accident. But when the Vietnam Memorial was built, the first listed names were those killed in 1959. So many names, and yet Harry Kramer, one of the first to die, wasn't there.
He gave no less and no more than every one of the other servicemen who died in Vietnam. And I think it's appropriate that his name be included among theirs.
The Pentagon and the memorial finally agreed.
In all, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial decided to add 68 new names that, for one reason or another, had originally been left off.
An artist started engraving new names: Charles McGonigal, Jerry Sanders, and Harry G. Kramer.
See where the rose is hanging right there?
Yeah. Oh, yes, Harry G. Kramer.
His sister and mother joined Hank Kramer today to see.
It's a tremendous emotional impact to see him there.
Yeah, I got one.
I'm glad he's finally there. These are the soldiers he served with, the soldiers he died with. I'm glad he's there.
Harry Kramer had no way of knowing in 1957 how many more would go to Vietnam, how many more would die. Had no way of knowing that someday, that this day, his name would be one among so many.
I'm doing this because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. I don't have a choice. I have paid my debt to him.
Peterson, CBS News, Washington.
You would think that Japan, with all its massive trade surpluses, wouldn't have much trouble balancing its own budget. You'd be wrong. Like the United States, Japan has been racking up record budget deficits. To try and reverse the situation, the government has turned to a most unlikely man. Bob Simon introduces us to him.
It's 4 in the morning, and Toshiko Doko, 87 years old, is already at prayer. Doko is one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in Japan. He is a Picasso of profitability. He makes $500,000 a year. He lives on $5,000. He is almost single-handedly forcing this nation to balance its budget, to hold down taxes. He is leading his own generation to a 15% cut in Social Security for the sake of future generations. The old follow his example. He and his wife, a younger woman, 78 years old, are proud of their ability to make do, of his clothes, his hat, which has become a symbol in Japan of the austerity he says all democracies will need to survive. Japan is growing old. It's growing old even faster than the United States. Expenditures on Social Security have doubled in the last 10 years. Slashing standards of living is not a pleasant job. Many believe it's precisely because of Doko's lifestyle that he was given this mandate and will prevail. After all, how could anyone argue against austerity in the presence of this man? Prime Minister Nakasone calls him my own personal god. Every conservative government could use one. Bob Simon, CBS News, Tokyo.